had put out a Reddit survey saying, for those of you who've left the Mormon church, what is it that the first thing that really started you on your faith crisis?
Seerstone.
Like they call it a faith crisis. And the Seerstone in the hat was 60%.
Welcome to Latter-day Saint Ideas. I'm Andrew Knopp. I'm joined today with my friend David Janeway and Jim Lucas, author of By Means of the Urim and Thummim, which is an awesome book I finished reading, Restoring Translation to the Restoration. Three things we really wanted to emphasize. There's tons in the book, but we really wanted to talk about three specific things. The Seerstone in the hat narrative, those who really support that really put a lot of weight on three specific individuals. It's Emma Smith, Martin Harris, and David Whitmer. And the three main sources that people cite are really actually quite questionable.
Right.
So Martin Harris was one of the witnesses to the translation process. And they even recreated this story of Martin Harris switching the Seerstone out of the hat in the Witnesses film, which I otherwise liked. I didn't like that part. But this is now sort of considered to be just a factually true story. But now we're going to talk about, is this story really from Martin Harris and how reliable is it?
So here's our new cast of characters. Martin Harris is to the left and Edward Stevenson's on the right. So Martin Harris was in the church. He too was excommunicated in the late 1830s. And
he pretty much stayed in Kirtland, Ohio, and kind of floated from group to group, right?
Floated from group to group, but he stayed in Kirtland.
Lucy Harris,
the wife who had given him such a hard time about working on the Book of Mormon, they divorced, and then he married Brigham Young's sister, and they had several children. And his wife kept wanting to move to Utah to be with her family, but she stayed in Kirtland with Martin. And then finally in 1856, Martin was just not going to go. And so finally she moved with her children to Utah. So Martin was living all by himself. He was still married. He had these living children, but they were in Utah. He kind of was not in good financial shape, but he stuck around, and he was happy to give tours of the Kirtland Temple, and he was happy to bear his testimony of the Book of Mormon.
Previous to the account we're going to talk about, where he mentions the Seerstone in a hat.
Right.
All of the other interviews he's done before these years, he talks about the Urim and Thummim.
That's right. That's the story, very consistent. He's only talking about the Urim and Thummim. And his three witnesses experience and seeing the angel and stuff like that. So he has a son of a cousin or something like that who's joined the church, who comes through at one point and visits him. So he's now in his 80s and says to Martin, wouldn't you like to come back and be with the saints in Utah and see your kids?
And your wife.
And your wife. And he kind of, he says to the kid, I would like to do that, but I can't afford to do that. I barely can feed myself. So the kid goes back to Utah and reports this kind of to people, and word gets around, and it comes to Edward Stevenson. Now, Edward Stevenson was an amazing character. He was one of the church's great missionaries. He basically spent his adult life just going on missions. Today we'd call him a people person. So Edward Stevenson, he's going east on a mission. So he goes see Martin Harris, and he says, wouldn't you like to come to Utah? And Martin says, yeah, I would, but I can barely afford to pay to eat, let alone travel all the way out to Utah. And so Edward Stevenson says, we will fix that. And he writes to Brigham Young and says, we got to raise money to get Martin Harris to Utah. So everybody quickly raises money. I think Edward Stevenson goes back to Utah to get the money together, and then he comes back to Kirtland. So the Transcontinental Railroad has just been completed. So it is now possible to take the train all the way to Utah. Edward Stevenson comes. He says, I got the money for a train ticket. I'll get you some nice clothes. Come on, let's go move to Utah. And Martin says, yeah, that's great. I'd be happy to do that. So a day or two before Martin's going to leave Kirtland, he has a medical episode. He is walking home late at night. He's gone to visit all of his neighbors in Kirtland and say goodbye. And he's walking through the field and he collapses. He passes out and he doesn't wake up until the next morning. Now, it sounds like he may have had a stroke. The man was into his 80s. So, and he was not been living well. So he was not in good health. Then he wakes up in the morning in the middle of this field, kind of gets up, brushes himself off, and goes over and finds Edward Stevenson and says, "Okay, I'm ready to go." So they go and they get on the train and they proceed to travel to Utah together. Now, this is still a long train trip. It takes like 4 or 5 days. So, on the course of this train trip, they got nothing to do but talk to each other. Martin recounts to him the stone swapping anecdote. Now, this would, if it happened, would have happened in 1828. This is 1870. So, this is Martin recounting this episode 42 years later, after maybe just having had a stroke. Edward Stevenson was an absolutely straight up guy. So there's no question that Martin told him some sort of story. Edward Stevenson would never have invented it. So that just happens, and it's nothing much really comes of it right away. But Edward Stevenson, he's a smart PR guy. He's a good missionary. He's a people person. And Edward Stevenson lets the newspaper know that they're coming. So they come down, and there's several interviews with Martin Harris. Edward Stevenson does not let this opportunity go to waste. One of the accounts of these newspaper guys who interviewed Martin Harris was the Iowa State Register, which was the largest newspaper in Des Moines. And this guy comes down when they're at the train station, and this newspaper reporter interviews Martin and then runs back and he prints this up right away in the Iowa State Register, which is the largest newspaper in the state. So, he's not going to let the story go cold. So this is a non-LDS source, but it is not doctored. It is not influenced. He's just getting the story from Martin and he's rushing back and putting it out so it's in the next day's newspaper. And it's description of how the Book of Mormon is translated. And he says that Martin said that there was also found in the chest, Urim and Thummim, the means of which the writing was on the plates was translated. It was a pair of large spectacles, as Mr. Harris termed them. So we know he's not talking about a Seerstone. He's talking about the Urim and Thummim here. So this is like hot off the press, directly from a credible, non-LDS source, as credible as you can get, that Martin was giving on this same trip where he recounted this stone swapping incident to Edward Stevenson. Anyways,
Interesting to have the contrast, right? Both are on the same trip, both are from the same person, and yet they're two different stories.
Right. So here's what happens. They get to Utah. Martin Harris moves up to Clarkston. So this is 1870, and he passes away in 1875. So he's living in Utah for 5 years. Lots of people want to go hear from Martin Harris. And we have lots of records of people who talk to him. Everybody wants to hear his testimony in the Book of Mormon. Martin is happy to share his testimony. And so we have lots of accounts of people saying, "Oh, I went and heard Martin Harris testify about the Book of Mormon, and this is what he said." And here's the thing. In all of that literature, this has all been collected. In none of these accounts does the stone swapping story appear. So he told Edward Stevenson the story, but he never repeated it. Instead, he's talking about the Urim and Thummim. Martin's being very consistent with that story that we just saw from the Iowa State Register. This is the story that he tells everybody consistently for the remaining 5 years of his life. No record whatsoever of him ever repeating that stone swapping story to anyone ever again.
And Edward Stevenson publishes it. It's after Martin's death, correct?
Right. So he writes up a little article about his memories, his recollections. That's just 7 years after Martin's death.
Is there evidence that he wrote the story he got from Martin on the train in his diary and then used that as his notes for the articles?
He makes no mention of the stone swapping incident in any of Edward Stevenson's diaries. So he writes this article for Deseret News. In the course of this article, it's a longish article, he has one short paragraph where he recounts the stone swapping incident. And in that account, he said, Joseph used the Urim and Thummim, but he could also translate with the Seerstone. And he says, for convenience, he could use the Seerstone. And so then Martin did this stone swapping thing. And he describes the stone swapping incident where Martin finds a stone that he thinks looks like the Seerstone that Joseph has. And so he switches them out. Now, remember, Martin says, when I was translating, there's always a blanket up between me and Joseph. So Martin doesn't really know. So he switches out the Seerstone, and Joseph says, oh, it's as black as Egypt. I can't see anything. And then Martin says, oh, I'm so sorry. Yeah, I switched. I played a trick on you. Now, Edward Stevenson reports that the reason that Martin did this was to prove the Book of Mormon. So we've actually dug down into it, and you never can say for certain this incident actually happened, but let's assume that it did. If it happened right after the lost pages. So you can figure Martin's situation here. He really feels bad about the lost pages, and he's desperately looking for something else. He can go back to the people in Palmyra and say, look, okay, I don't have those pages anymore. I don't know what happened to them, but I did this, and this proves that Joseph's the real deal. He's looking for anything that he can go back and mainly tell his wife, to justify all this money and time he's spending on this Book of Mormon project. It's a very small part of Edward Stevenson's article. It's just something he threw in, and because it's a fun story. And Edward Stevenson was the kind of guy who had an ear for a good story. That was his personality. So he threw it in, but he said that sometimes he'd use the Seerstone for convenience. That's the phrase that's in the Edward Stevenson's article that's going to become important. The issue that we confront in dealing with the stone in the hat narrative is this tendency of some historians to cherry pick single little phrases out of the historical record that seem to back up the Seerstone in the hat account and not look at them in their full context. And there's this little phrase, for convenience, which has blown up into a whole theory that Joseph mainly used the Seerstone because the Urim and Thummim was too awkward with the breastplate and all that. That's all speculation that just comes back to this one little phrase that Edward Stevenson put in his article, for convenience. A huge part of the stone in the hat narrative rests on that one little phrase, for convenience. But now let's back up and put it in its full historical context. In 1893, Edward Stevenson publishes a book. So in this book, he includes this illustration. So he includes the stone swapping incident, but he drops the words for convenience. He just says, Joseph could translate with the Seerstone. That he says one time in his book. 20 times in his book, he says, Joseph translated with the Urim and Thummim. So Edward Stevenson, who is the sole person to have ever heard the stone swapping story, even he's a Urim and Thummim guy. He's saying it's the Urim and Thummim. Joseph needed the Urim and Thummim. God provided the Urim and Thummim. So he includes this lithograph, which is widely published. What is Angel Moroni handing to Joseph?
Right, spectacles, looking like spectacles.
That's right. The Urim and Thummim, which are described as looking like spectacles. And you can see the breastplate down on the ground there. So this is the one illustration, because lithographs was kind of expensive to include a lithograph in a book. It's repeated on church literature and so forth. And it's Moroni delivering the Urim and Thummim to Joseph Smith, and clearly not a Seerstone. And some people say that Edward Stevenson was actually the guy who did the lithograph. So what we have here is one little incident, really just the words for convenience, which Edward Stevenson only used once, just being blown, cherry-picked, and completely blown out of proportion. But when you look at it in the totality of the context of what both Martin Harris and Edward Stevenson actually said about the translation of the Book of Mormon, it's like there's 100 statements and 2 mention Seerstone and 98 mention Urim and Thummim. How do you come around to ignoring the 98 where both Martin and Edward Stevenson are saying Urim and Thummim? It was a minor incident even to Martin. And it also raises a whole bunch of questions. Even if you assume, okay, the stone swapping incident does tell us something about how the Book of Mormon is translated, no one asked the question, was Joseph fooled? I mean, assume that you just take it at face value and say, oh, okay, this is legitimate story. You think,
Joseph
I
can't
mean,
tell the difference between his own Seerstone and this one that Martin Harris pulls out of the river or whatever.
that's exactly right. And in fact, our friend Jerry Grover, who's a geologist, tells us that if the Seerstone is that round striped Seerstone the church has in its archives, that
Yeah.
that's actually an extremely rare kind
Yeah,
of
I've
a
read about
stone.
that. Yeah, yeah. Carried around
It's
in
a
a dinosaur's stomach for a bunch
yeah,
of.
it came out of a dino, and you'd never find a stone like that in the eastern United States, let alone just pick one up off the river.
Yeah.
So it's a very unique kind of a stone. So our interpretation of the incident is that not only was Joseph not using the Seerstone to translate, but when Martin switched it out on him, thinking that he was using it, because Martin was kind of a big Seerstone believer. He was kind of in that atmosphere of the time. And if our chronology is right, that this was right after the Lost Pages incident, the way we interpret the incident is that Joseph saw this and he just didn't have it in him to give Martin a hard time. Poor
So
Martin,
he's humoring him, kind of.
he was kind of humoring him. He'd already been rebuked by the Lord for losing the pages. But Joseph was not the kind of guy who would pile on. So he probably, played along with Martin because he just didn't want to give him more grief when he'd already had a ton of grief and was clearly feeling really bad and really desperate to do something to redeem himself from having been responsible for losing the pages. There's an important point to that, which is it's such a minor incident. It's so unimportant to Martin that he never even tells anybody else about it. It's so unimportant to Edward Stevenson that he just treats it as an amusing side anecdote. They don't know that it's going to be completely blown out of proportion 120 years later by people who have adopted E.B. Howe's Stone in the Hat interpretation.
Now, what's funny, you mentioned about the for convenience statement. And the reason I'm glad is that was the two words that made me start going, some of this stuff isn't adding up, because there's nothing convenient about translation. There's nothing convenient about the plates and putting them in the ground, what the Nephites went through, what Joseph went through, what his family went through, what Emma went through, that it was one of those things that kind of started me questioning some of these things.
It doesn't sound like the setup is ever convenient, where you got to have a scribe, you've got to have paper, you've got to have some kind of a divider, you've got to have Joseph, you've got to have people not interrupting you, and whoever knows the mob might be coming by. It never seems like it's going to be a convenient time to do this in general.